spent teaching the 4th through 6th graders. I expect you guys to listen a little bit better. I'm very thankful to be teaching this class. I'll put it that way. I have no snacks or Kool-Aid. But we're going to continue talking about Acts. You guys have been studying Acts. And we actually took, during the summer, I'd found a series on Acts, the first 10 or 11 chapters, and that's what we did in the 4th through 6th graders. So I think Bill and Kevin have continued that if they're not through already for the summer. And, you know, it's just Acts being action, right? So it's a like an action novel, in my opinion, of things. And I think what we're going to study today, which is Acts 21 through 23, parts of 23, are really, the way I look at it, is kind of why we're here today. It's sort of the apex of Paul's ministry, I guess, and change, or him explaining that. And to me, it's like a Shakespearean story, but even better. I mean, there's just so much packed into these 2 chapters that we're going to talk about today. I think it's about 64 verses. As I was studying through this, I just kept coming back to the thought of, like, wow, to be in that environment, to be have had a view of what was going on there then, both culturally, politically, militarily. I love studying about that anyway, that period of history. It's just amazing. Just, you know, from a secular standpoint, what was going on during that 400 or 500 years around the birth of Christ, a couple hundred before, a couple hundred after. And this is set right in the middle of that. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And just to sort of set the stage, if you haven't been here, we're going to start with around verse 17 of chapter 21. But prior to that, so the first 17 verses, the first 16 verses of Acts 21, it's talking about Paul's, and even before that, Paul's missionary journeys. And, you know, he went on several missionary journeys. And if you look at a map, and I love looking at maps when I'm studying the Bible, I did as a kid, I always would turn to the end notes and try and figure out where things were. To me, it just makes it so much more real than to be very abstract and just these names of these cities. I want to know where they were. I want to know where they were in relationship to what exists today. Because so much of what's happening in the world today is centered in that same area. Here we are 2,000 years later. And there's still volatility, and has been for 2,000 years. For better or worse, whatever your take on it is. But there was volatility then, there's volatility now, and I want to know why. I like to know why things happen, who was leading the actions. And so in this case, we've got Paul. He'd been in Macedonia and Greece, so basically Turkey and Greece in that area, cities of Thessalonica, Corinth, Ephesus, among others, teaching and preaching and meeting with leaders in those areas and trying to grow the church of the Gentiles. He was not, as we know, he was not sent to teach to the Jews, which kind of gets him in trouble here in a second. But presently, in these first 15, 20 verses of chapter 21, you know, he has passed by Ephesus so he can try and get to Jerusalem for Pentecost. That's what he's trying to do. And they had made ports of call, visits in Kos, Rhodes, Patara. And when I read Rhodes, you know, I immediately think of the Colossus of Rhodes. And you guys may have talked about this. And just, you know, one of the ancient wonders of the world, and was built maybe 100 years prior, 150 years prior, as you entered that port there. And they arrive in Tyre, which is in present-day Lebanon. So again, a very volatile place then and now. 50 miles south of what is now Beirut. And he gets out, works his way down the coast of Caesarea, which is in northern Israel near Haifa. And they stay at the home of Philip, who was last talked about and seen, made his appearance in Acts 8. So as far as this study goes, 13, 14 weeks ago. So that's where we are. And as he's meeting there with the brethren, they implore him not to leave. Do not go to Jerusalem. If you've ever seen, "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" Do not seek the treasure is what I thought about when I read this. Like, don't go there. There are bad things that are going to happen. And Paul is firmly resolute in his decision and his desire to go to Jerusalem. And so they say, okay, it's your life. You can go. But he's, he believes he's acting on the will of God, that is part of his purpose to go there. And maybe he was aware of what was going to happen. Maybe he believed that because he was who he was, he had been a very devout Jew, a Jew among Jews, right? And so, look at me, I've changed. Let me give them my testimony and they'll change too. I think it's probably the latter part of that. Or he just was like, I'm going no matter what, and I'm going to face the consequences. And then we get to Acts 21:17, which is sort of where we're going to start today, which signifies the official end of Paul's our third major evangelistic trip. So that's kind of where we are in setting the stage. You guys, if you've been in this class, you've gotten to that point. And while I was teaching 4th through 6th graders. So, and I'm going to read here, and then maybe I'll ask somebody. We've got 65 verses, so we're going to move a little bit quickly. And then I'll have some comments. You guys, if you have questions at any point, just raise your hand, and we'll kind of talk through them and see what we can arrive at. So I want to start with Acts 21, verse 17. And then this is sort of setting the stage for, again, kind of what's to come after this. After we arrived in Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. And the following day, Paul went with us to James. And I believe this is James the Less, who was a cousin of Jesus, is kind of what I've read. There are a lot of Jameses in the Bible. But he went with us to James, and all the elders were present. And after he greeted them, he began to relate one by one the things which God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. Now, he's been gone quite a while throughout this missionary trip, or these missionary trips. And so, when I was younger, maybe some of you, if you grew up in churches who were sponsoring missionaries, the missionaries would come back maybe every couple of years, and you'd have a slideshow presentation, not PowerPoint, but actual slides, right? And so I'm kind of envisioning that, where he's, proverbially got pictures that he's showing and saying, here's what I did, and here's the people I met with, and here's the impact that the ministry has had, which is, that's very encouraging. The message is spreading, right? And when they heard, so verse 20, we'll pick it up. And when they heard it, they began glorifying God. And they said to him, you see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. And they've been told about you, that you are teaching all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to the customs. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come. Therefore, do this that we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take them and purify yourself with them. Pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads, and all will know that there is nothing to the things which they have been told about you, but that you yourself also walk orderly, keeping the law. They've got a plan for him, right? Hey, we're going to fix this stuff. We're going to make it where, hey, all this stuff that they're saying about you is not true, and you're going to prove to them that it's not true. Verse 25. But concerning the Gentiles who have believed, we wrote, having decided that they should abstain from meat sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what is strangled, and from fornication. Then Paul took them in, and the next day, purifying himself along with them, went into the temple, giving notice of the completion of the days of purification until the sacrifice was offered for each of them. So we've got maybe some conflicts here. It's sort of hard to reconcile what Paul has been teaching in his journeys, and then the teaching of Paul concerning the end of the law of Moses with his participation with Jewish purification rites. How do we reconcile those? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
He seems like a hypocrite.
That would be one interpretation, right?
I forget where it's at. Paul said, I would that I could become all things to all men so that I might win some.
Right.
He is appearing to keep the law so that he can blend in for now, and that's nothing wrong with that. Paul knows who his Lord is, and he's going to try and win him over however he can.
Yeah. Anybody else have any thoughts on this? David?
One of my favorite things about Paul is that he's not afraid to offend people as long as it's what God has asked him to do. Some of the best preachers I've ever heard have said, I'm going to share some things with you, and some of you are not going to like it. And I'm happy about that. Sometimes when we're doing what God wants us to do, it's offensive to the world. It's not what they want to see. It's not how they want to see it. And Paul was like, I did what I did, but because you guys asked me to do this, I'll do it.
From this passage, it seems like when he's writing to the Corinthians, when he's writing to, the other churches, he's trying to walk a fine line of, you're free, but don't do things that offend other people. You're free, but be careful you don't affect somebody else's faith with your decisions. And this seems to be like one of those moments where I've been telling other people you don't have to do this, but they asked me to do it because some people will be offended and they don't want to hurt the ones they've been working with. So I'll go ahead and do it.
Yeah. And so far as we know, they talk about, where I just read, it says you've been preaching to the Jews amongst the Gentiles. Is that really what he was doing? Probably not. He was preaching to the Gentiles, I think, right? Not the Jews among the Gentiles. Maybe that was kind of ancillary to that.
I think the Jews, as much as they hated him at the beginning, they were offended now that he was not spending any time with them because he was a Jew. And I mean, that's just conjecture. It doesn't say that per se, but Paul was very, very talented in presenting concepts and philosophy and the getting his point across in words. But it's a little like a master and an apprentice. A master knows when you sort of nuance things and make them you tickle the throttle as opposed to just all on or all off. Right. And it's difficult, particularly when you're communicating through letters rather than in person, to get your point across in the way that you intended. That's why I dislike social media. One of the many reasons. Because unless you can have a face-to-face conversation, it doesn't have the same effect that sitting across from one another, looking at each other's eyes, looking at each other's physical responses and so forth can have.
Yeah, one of the things, so I teach in a business school in college, and I teach information systems, but we also have communications that are taught. And one of the things that they teach is, if you're going to type an email, type out what you're going to type, but don't put the person's name in there. Go back and read it. Did you really, and read it from their viewpoint, right? Because you're right. These letters have been sent. They've been shared amongst a lot of people. And now he's kind of there with them. So now you get the real flavor of this. Also remember at this time, we're in a transition, right? And it's 60, 70, 80, 100-year transition of going from the Mosaic Law, where, here's some absolute things that you must and must not do, to the point where there were books written about each one of these. And you had kind of the growth of the Jewish leaders in interpreting all of these. And so then you had people who, were maybe even held in higher esteem than the prophets had been held at. And those who, and Moses, and even those who came before, because they were learned, they were scholarly. And it's kind of like this transition now to following the way, which we get to here in a minute. And there's this transition of what do we do? We're Jewish by custom. We're Jewish by religion. We're Jewish by where we live. But what does that mean? And I think he's sort of fighting against that as well. He's been out, think about going and living somewhere else for many years and then coming back home. And you've gone out and you've seen the world, and you bring the world back to where you were from. We've kind of lived all over. And a few years out of college, we moved to New York City. I'm from Alabama, small town in Alabama. And the differences in the churches and how church just operationally was conducted was pretty stark for me, or striking differences. And I can remember kind of coming back during that first year to where my parents went, where I grew up going to church. And my dad's like, all right, we want you, he was one of the leaders in the church. He said, we want you to kind of speak to what you've been seeing here in New York. And one of my takes was like, look, what they're doing in New York, probably not going to fit in here. And what y'all are doing here, probably not going to fit in New York. But you've got to reach those people in different ways, and through different methods. And, we sing 2 songs before the Lord's Supper here. They sing 3. Okay. I mean, it was kind of some of that kind of stuff. And it was, but I mean, the traditions that I'd grown up with versus the traditions that people in different places that you guys have grown up with in different places, they're meaningful traditions. But what do we have to do? How do we have to resolve them? We're told to come together. And I think he's fighting against some of this, and that his way of looking at it sort of gets a little bit in trouble here.
Yeah, I have had a lot of similar experiences worshiping in different places, but this is quite a bit different. I mean, he's going back into the place where the leaders of this church actually decided to organize the death of Jesus. And so now he's going back and is sponsoring these guys. Means that he's going back to pay for their sacrifices, to buy the animals. And I think it must be okay. I mean, it's written down here. But if Randy all of a sudden said, hey, I'm going to go over and I'm going to do something at this other church, and I'm going to do some things there. And I think we would have a lot of questions about it. We'd have a lot of raised eyebrows. And I think it's a little bit interesting in the couple of chapters right leading up to this. It's all about the Spirit. The Spirit is leading him to go back. The Spirit is there's people prophesying that tells what's going to happen when he gets here. But when they get there, we don't hear anything about the Spirit now. We hear about some men at basically the local congregation that are afraid having Paul come in to be at to come and visit them at their church is going to cause a lot of stink. And so what we're going to do is we're going to make it look not so bad by having you go up here. And of course, it's going to be a huge backfire. But he was going right into the place where the people that he had been ministering to would not be allowed to go in with him. So it would be, I think this turns out to be pretty controversial.
Just real quick, this could be one of those things when Paul says, why do I do what I know I don't want to do? I do it anyway. Who knows? But it could have been fit in there as well.
And so James and the elders, they suggest what he should do. He does some purification. And also refers to a letter to the Gentiles, again, talking about the matter of liberty and for Jewish converts and not a requirement for Gentiles. I think that's important. There's kind of that dividing line still between Jewish customs and what's expected and the Gentiles. And of course, we're in this transition period for that. All right, let's go to Acts 21, 27 through 40. Does anybody want to read that? Any volunteers? I'll read it if not. David? So Acts 21, 27 through 40, which is Paul being seized in the temple.
And when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews which were of Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the people and laid hands on him, crying out, Men of Israel, help. This is the man that teaches all men everywhere against the people and the law and this place, and further brought Greeks also into the temple, and hath polluted this holy place. For they had seen before with him in the city of Trophimus an Ephesian, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. And all the city was moved, and the people ran together, and they took Paul and drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut. And as they went about to kill him, tidings came unto the chief captain of the band that all Jerusalem was in an uproar, who immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down unto them. And when they saw the chief captain and the soldiers, they left, beating of Paul. Then the chief captain came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains, and demanded who he was and what he had done. And some cried one thing, some another, among the multitude. And when he could not know the certainty of the tumult, he commanded him to be carried into the castle. And when he had come up upon the stairs, so it was that he was borne of the soldiers for the violence of the people. For the multitude of the people followed after, crying, Away with him. And as Paul was led into the castle, he said unto the chief captain, May I speak unto thee? Who said, Canst thou speak Greek? Are not thou and that Egyptian, which before these days madest an uproar, and leddest out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers? But Paul said, I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, that I beseech thee, suffer me to speak unto the people. And when he had given him license, Paul stood on the stairs, and beckoned with the hand unto the people. And when there was made a great silence, he spake unto them in the Hebrew tongue, saying.
And we'll continue that conversation here in a second. you guys remember what was going on in Ephesus? What was there? I mean, there were some great temples in Ephesus. A lot of idol worshipers. So they're like, hey, you're bringing this person from that's an Ephesian into the temple, defiling the temple. He goes on, and if you and talks about, or the passage goes on and talks about, kind of interpreting this as like, hey, the Romans are going to not allow any kind of uproar. So they would come in, they would beat, destroy the people, the leaders of any kind of uprising into capitulation, and then they would station their mayors, their governors, their leaders, and their basically what they were their key success matrix was there better be peace and you better collect taxes, and those were kind of the two main things if you were going to be a leader in the Roman Empire, in any place outside of Rome, that you better keep the peace and you better collect taxes. And a governor who allowed riots and mobs to go forth and destroy or cause any kind of uprisings, that did not sit well in Rome. And so you've got these Roman sentries, these commanders, and their life is on the line as well if they allowed this stuff to happen. So they're going to put an end to it. In verse 38, as we get on, he's talking to the commander, and the commander basically says, "Are you not that Egyptian that we've heard about?" Now, Josephus refers to this in his war histories, and there is a passage from Josephus that there was an Egyptian who had led 30 or 40,000 people and had gotten as close to Jerusalem as the Mount of Olives, and was stopped when Felix, who was the governor, came upon him with a large group of Roman soldiers and centurions, and so probably thousands of soldiers, and they have a little clash. Hundreds of people are killed, hundreds of people are imprisoned, and the Egyptian escaped is sort of the take here. And so the centurion's like, "Hey, are you that guy? Are you the one?" Because he sees the riots that are the mobs that are happening, and the Jews are in an uproar, and kind of deduces that Paul is the Egyptian. Well, of course he's not. And he says, "You know what? I'm actually a Jew, and I'm from Tarsus." And he says it's no insignificant city. Tarsus is, and I believe was at that time, one of the largest cities in that area. I think it's the fourth largest city now in there. And so he's recognized, by others who have seen him in Asia. And, they're saying, you're the guy that spoke of the way. And you're the guy who has caused problems in other areas. One thing I've never understood in this, whether it's past times or present day or whatever's going to happen in the future, is people who assemble in thousands to riot and destroy things, kind of anarchist. I look at that and I'm like, I don't want to be a part of that. Even if they're in the right, I don't want to be caught up in that. But this is what happens. We see this time and time again throughout the Bible and throughout history. And there were great crowds that were assembled here because it was Pentecost. So you've already got people from all over that are coming together in Jerusalem, different dialects, different languages, different cultures, different people, but they're there for Pentecost. And so it's already kind of a volatile situation. And they believe that the temple is being threatened, right? It's being defiled. It's being physically threatened. If this guy's the Egyptian that's come to destroy the temple, which is what that guy was doing or trying to do, hey, we're going to assemble and protect it. And they grab him and drag him out of the temple and begin to viciously beat him. So Paul is in trouble. And fortunately, we have this Roman commander, Claudius Lysias, who comes and basically says, "What's going on here? Why are you being beaten? What have you started?" And Paul, as he's being led away into this formal investigation, says, "Can I address the crowd? Like, let me talk to them." And I think in his mind, he's thinking, again, I can convince you because of who I was prior to being Paul. When I was Saul, I was kind of in the same situation you were. Let me convince you that what I'm doing now is correct.
That's almost exactly what I was going to say. The irony here that when Saul was a Jew and a Christian would come up and say Jesus is Lord, he would attack them, he would beat them, he would throw them in prison. This is the exact same treatment that he received or that he gave out is now what he's receiving. There's a full circle here of now he's proclaiming Jesus, and now he's the one on the receiving end of the threats and the beatings and the murderous intent.
Exactly. Yeah. Anybody else? Will.
Yeah, I was thinking this whole time the similarities between him and Stephen is impeccable. Like the same accusations that they levied against Stephen, that he's coming at not only us as people but our city and this place. The same accusations that they levied at Stephen. So, and Paul is about to give a speech. He's about to tell them about his journey. There's no doubt in my mind, him being there when Stephen was stoned and approving of it, that had to be going through his mind. And the fact that he still did it speaks volumes to where he was and where he was at that moment.
Exactly.
Mine's really a question.
Okay.
In the beginning, when you started reading about the brothers and sisters, and he went to all the elders who were present, this was a different governing group of people, correct? Compared to the people that were the mobs that came to them.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, maybe some of them were among them, but in the beginning, he is going to the leaders, right?
Right. And so the leaders of the temple now, is there a division? Like, okay, we got the Christian leaders and these guys are a sect and they have elders? Or when Paul goes to Jerusalem to the temple, are there still just one set of leaders?
No. Somebody want to answer that? Because
It's
I think it's speculation, but
well,
yeah.
You talked about, which was helpful to me, you said there was a whole group of people because there was Pentecost. Okay.
Right.
Then I said, okay. Because if that's the case, then all those people weren't following the way. They weren't following that group.
And for them, and I think we can even see this in some of the things that Jesus does is, and maybe for them, they're looking at that as well, that this is just a continuation of for lack of a better word, Judaism. It's not a whole new thing. And maybe there's some progressions along the way, and we've modified some of the things that we're doing. I mean, I'm speculating, but I'm thinking that is, again, it's this transition period, right? And when the temple is destroyed in 70 AD, that kind of, like, they no longer have this temple that, in effect, it is this huge holy place, right? We're done with that. It no longer exists. And so that seems to be kind of the point at which things, even if you just read secular history, things change at that point. So.
In verse 5 of 22, Paul refers to the high priest and the council, probably the Sanhedrin, about the letters that to persecute and jail those who were make them prisoners, so on. So there's a reference there to people, the leadership that he's referring to, they remember me probably,
Mhm.
something along those lines. Now, Caiaphas or Caiaphas, however you say it, was, I think, the son-in-law to Ananias. Ananias, at the time of Jesus' arrest, was technically to the Jews. He was the real high priest. The other one was a Roman installment, and they did it, I think, every year. But anyhow, those men may still have been there when Paul returned to Jerusalem, or it could have been somebody newer. But he's referring to him there in verse 5 of 22 that, hey, I've been here before. They remember. So anyway,
Yeah, let's read through that. And I will sort of read through that here in a second. Acts 22, and I'll read the first 21 verses here. So this is his defense before the Jews, and so he's been brought before them. He's been, he has asked to speak to the crowd here. And he says, "Brother and fathers, hear my defense, which I now offer you." And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew dialect, they became even more quiet. And he said, "I am a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, and brought up in this city, educated under Gamaliel, strictly according to the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, just as all of you are today. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and putting men in prison, men and women in prisons. Also, the high priest and all the council of the elders can testify," going to Roger's point. "From then I received letters to the brethren and started off for Damascus in order to bring even those who were there in Jerusalem as prisoners to be punished." So he's admitting, like, look, I used to do this, I used to go out and I would bring people to be punished to death. "But it happened that I was on my way approaching Damascus about noontime. A very bright light suddenly flashed from heaven all around me, and I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?' And I answered, 'Who are you, Lord?' And he said to me, 'I am Jesus the Nazarene, whom you are persecuting.' And those who were with me saw the light, to be sure, but they didn't understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me. And I said, 'What shall I do, Lord?' And the Lord said to me, 'Get up, go on to Damascus, and you'll be told of all that has been appointed for you to do.' But since I could not see because of the brightness of the light, I was led by hand by those who were with me and came to Damascus. A certain Ananias, a man who was devout by the standard of the law and well spoken of by all the Jews who lived there, came to me and standing near unto me said, 'Brother Saul, receive your sight.' And at that very time I looked up to him, and he said, 'The God of our fathers has appointed you to know his will and to see the righteous one and to hear an utterance from his mouth. For you will be a witness for him to all the men of what you have seen and heard. Then why do you delay? Get up, be baptized, wash away your sins, calling on his name.' It happened when I returned to Jerusalem and he was praying in the temple that I fell into a trance, and I saw him saying to me, 'Make haste, get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me.' And I said, 'Lord, they themselves understand that in one synagogue after another I used to imprison and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of your witness Stephen was being shed, I was also standing by approving and watching out for the coats of those who were slaying him.' And he said to me, 'Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles.'" So he wants to stay. Jesus, in this trance, in this vision, says, "Get out of here. Go. I'm going to send you. You've got a different mission than to sit here in Jerusalem." And so he's been granted permission to speak. He defends himself. The main points here, Paul's partisan Jewish background. So he says, "I was a Jew. I was educated under Gamaliel, who at the time was sort of the preeminent scholar. It says he had a doctorate of Jewish law. So obviously very, very, very educated. Paul was at that, I guess when he studied under him, kind of the same way. He probably didn't get his doctorate. He probably didn't write his dissertation, but he was probably very well known, at least at that time. But in the time since then, there have been a lot of high priests. I think there's something like 28 high priests from the time he left until about 25 or 30 years later. So it was almost like every year there was a new high priest, Mike.
I believe Gamaliel was also a member of the Sanhedrin.
And he had, earlier on when some of the brethren or some of the apostles had been preaching and teaching, and they were being assaulted and abused, he was one who said, "Hey, maybe chill out a little bit too." So he was held in great esteem, and he had, and that goes back to Acts 5, where he had said, show some leniency to these apostles. Let's hear what they have to say, and we'll kind of end there, I guess, for the day. David.
Okay. Leanne asked about the leadership differences, possibly. All the Jews, Christ himself included, when he was still alive, they went to these festivals, or as they're called in the Old Testament, holy convocations. They were, in essence, dress rehearsals for what God has planned in his plan, to get them in the habit of these certain times of the year, be there, be part of it. And then I would assume there were when Paul first got to Jerusalem, because it mentions James, he was with the leaders of the Christian movement, but it doesn't specify that.
Right. Okay. I think we're out of time. So we got most of the way through what I wanted to get through. There's a whole other chapter that we probably needed to get through, but where Paul appears before the council, and they don't like that, and he's kind of in trouble. So maybe we'll get to that, or somebody will get to that in a future week. But let's say a prayer real quick, and then we'll go to worship. So, Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for the examples that you give us throughout the Bible on what to do, what not to do, how to live our lives, and people that we can look at who lived and set an example of being fearless for you. Help us to do that in our own lives. Father, forgive us as we forgive each other. Help us have a great worship today. In Christ's name we pray.